nationalisation maybe still scares enough people for governments to think twice about it, although I think with the banks, virtually that's what happened.
We have renationalised banks at the moment, yes.
So
And
I'm just sort of commenting on the terminology, I think.
And the infrastructure is in public ownership, isn't it?
Mm.
The infrastructure is in public ownership. It's the operating companies which are private.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of privatised structure. But I think the thing is, I mean, I'm often asked about utilities like power and water and that sort of thing. And now that's, our privatised model obviously isn't working, but I think there were, and with good reason, concerns about the old nationalised model for those too. Which is where, in terms of particularly thinking of energy, what you look at a much better model is a much more localised model, and you have community ownership. So, you know, I spend a lot of time being challenged about wind farms. And I think, one of the things you think about is if a giant multinational energy company comes along and, puts up a plan to stick a giant wind farm up on the hill above a village or town, often there's an awful lot of resistance, a lot of planning fights, a lot of that. Because the town is going to see its whole landscape change. The whole way it looks on the world is going to change. And it's not going to see any benefit. Because again, what's going to happen, just like the multinational supermarket company, the money will just swoosh straight off the top of those wind turbines, float off into the distance, quite likely into a tax haven again, and they'll see nothing of it. But if that wind farm on the hill is owned by the town or village, and the benefits of that actually flow down the hill into the village, and you get a new roof on the village hall, you get some new facilities in the school, you get some bus trips for the older residents, then that wind farm on the hill actually looks different. It really looks like a different kind of institution. It's part of, that's our wind farm. And one of the things that sometimes provokes great incredulity when I say it in very Tory places, there are large parts of continental Europe where communities are fighting to get wind farms. They want a community wind farm because they want all the benefits for their community of having that wind farm. And so we need to look in terms of, utilities and that. You'd have water split by natural catchment areas. And so people manage the water in their own area for their own use. And that makes perfect sense. And that kind of community model of ownership for lots of things is a much better way forward than a kind of overall nationalised model. But with railways, when ultimately you are running trains, 6 different lines through the one central station, then there is a lot of logic of the nationalised model. And I think, there's a general acceptance of, even among people for whom nationalisation is a horror word. I was speaking to a meeting of FTSE 100 executives, which I wasn't necessarily expecting to be the most friendly meeting that I've ever attended. But actually, when I said renationalise the railways, they kind of went, yeah. And the guy who was the most resistant, the most right-wing man in the room said, well, it's such a mess, I suppose you've got to.
Yeah. On that point about community ownership of wind farms, that's very much the Danish model. That's how a lot of the on-land turbines in Denmark started up. And what you tend to find is they're in smaller clusters because the communities help to design them. They will tend to have a smaller cluster which has less impact, whereas the big companies will want to cram in as much as they can in the windiest locations. So there's also benefits for the ownership in terms of the environmental impact as well as the local benefit. But I think we've got enormous opportunities for renewable energy, particularly here in the east of England. And I think actually offshore wind is the big one to go for in eastern England because we've got the shallow North Sea. But although you wouldn't think it this spring, solar. I think, our policy for a long time has been we think every new building, unless there are technical reasons why you couldn't, should have solar on the roof. Every single one of them, whether it's hot water, whether it's PV. And that, of course, will help to reduce the unit costs if they go into developments from the start. But as a member of the planning committee, I can tell you we've had some interesting tussles with developers about this. Some of them are great. Some of them say, yeah, absolutely. How many do you want? And others will fight it tooth and nail. But Braintree's got quite a good reputation for asking for renewable energy. And of course, if they expect that, they're more likely to put it in up front.
Well, I mean, the place you want to go, and often people say, Britain's not sunny enough for solar, to which one of the answers is, well, Germany has an enormous amount of solar installation. And I don't think Germany's any sunnier than Britain. But again, if you want to go and see lots of solar in action, you can go to Kirklees in Yorkshire, which I think is probably definitely not sunnier than Essex. And there's one Green councillor up there, Councillor Andrew Cooper, who is Mr. Renewable Energy and Mr. Insulation. And he can take you around Primrose Hill Solar Village, which is a development of social housing, basically council housing, and it just has solar panels on every conceivable surface everywhere. And those solar panels feed into the homes, and so people get the feed-in tariff, and so their bills are much lower. So it really is genuinely affordable housing in terms of the cost of running it is very low. And, that's in Kirklees in Yorkshire. So if they've got enough sun to make it work, there's certainly enough sun around here.
Many, many years ago, I was persuaded of this argument when I was still thinking about solar, when we were in the Shetland Islands. And there was a bus shelter, obviously probably about 3 miles away from the grid. And it had a light powered by a solar panel. And I thought, well, if a solar panel can work in Shetland, that's a good argument.